Putin went on Russian state television and effectively accused the President of the United States of walking away from a deal over Donbas. And then, in almost the same breath, admitted the deal was never signed, never written down, never actually agreed. The man who spent nearly a year letting his officials sell the world on the spirit of Anchorage just quietly conceded there was no letter to that spirit at all. And the reason he's conceding it now, right now, this week, tells you more about the state of Russia's war than any frontline map could. Because here's what that admission is really covering for. It's the 5th of July, 2026. And while Americans are lighting fireworks, the Kremlin is watching its own oil refineries light up from Ukrainian drones 1,000 miles from the front. Putin isn't rewriting the Alaska story because he's winning. He's rewriting it because the thing he thought diplomacy would hand him, Donbas, his army still cannot take. If you want the version of this story that the cable networks are too polite to spell out, follow. It genuinely helps. Now, let's get into what actually happened, because the sequence matters. Go back to August 2025, Trump and Putin meet in Anchorage. No joint document comes out of it. Trump says in that way he does no deal until there's a deal, while also hinting that a lot of ground had been covered. Putin talks about understanding and root causes, and into that gap, that little space between there's no deal and there's an understanding, the Kremlin poured an entire narrative. They called it the spirit of Anchorage. The suggestion, never quite stated outright, was that Washington had privately blessed Russia's core demand that Ukraine hand over the whole of the Donbas, including the parts Russia has never managed to occupy, in exchange for freezing the lines everywhere else. That's the deal. Putin is now accusing Trump of breaking, except pause on what it would have meant. It wasn't a deal to end a war on the current lines. It was a deal to give Russia land its soldiers had failed to conquer by handing Moscow at the negotiating table the territory it couldn't win in the trenches, a diplomatic shortcut to a battlefield objective. And that's the tell. You don't need a diplomatic shortcut to something you're about to take anyway. Now, watch how the story unraveled, because it happened fast and it happened in public. For months, Russian officials leaned on this phrase, then the cracks. Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov, who'd been out on a limb over Alaska, suddenly claimed he'd never used the phrase spirit of Anchorage at all, and instead accused the West of departing from the understandings. Ushakov, Putin's own aide, had earlier said he knew nothing about any spirit either. Lavrov went the other direction and insisted Russia had actually agreed to American proposals. Some of them, he said, even before Alaska. So denying there were agreements looked from Moscow's side like bad faith, and then Rubio, the Secretary of State, who was physically in the room in Anchorage, cut it down with one sentence. There was a proposal in Alaska, he said. There was no agreement in Alaska. And then the line that really lands, if there had been an agreement, the war would already be over. Sit with that. The most senior American diplomat who was there is saying the thing Moscow built a year of messaging on simply did not exist as a binding commitment. Rubio went further and named the sticking point out loud, that Russia wants the entirety of Donetsk turned over to it, among other things, and that was never something the U.S. signed on to. So then the question becomes, why would Putin, of all people, back up Rubio's version? Because he did. At the end of June, he told a state TV reporter, and I'm paraphrasing his words carefully here, that there really were no agreements in Anchorage, that nobody signed anything, but that certain possibilities for ending the conflict were discussed, and the compromises on the table were the ones the American side had put forward. He confirmed the American account. The strong man conceded the point. Rulers like Putin do not concede points for sport. So what changed? Look at the ground. This is where it stops being a semantic fight about a summit and starts being about steel and men and money. The Institute for the Study of War, ISW, the group that tracks this daily meter by meter, put out its assessment at the start of July. In June of 2026, Russian forces seized or infiltrated a little over 30 square kilometers for the entire month. Average pace, about 1 square kilometer a day. Now compare that to June of last year, 2025, when Russia was taking more than 480 square kilometers in a month, roughly 16 a day. Same army, same war, a fraction of the movement. Let me put those two numbers side by side because the contrast is the whole story. 16 kilometers a day a year ago, 1 kilometer a day now. And even that 1 kilometer, ISW notes, comes at heavy cost in casualties and equipment. And it's mostly creeping urban fighting around a single city, Kostyantynivka, in Donetsk. Across the first 6 months of this year, Russia advanced into less than 30% of the territory it took in the same stretch of 2025. The offensive is running down. It's not collapsing. I want to be precise. Nobody's saying the Russian army is breaking, but it's grinding to something close to a standstill, and it has been slowing steadily since last November. Here's the part that gives Putin's Donbas obsession its edge. The entire objective, the political heart of this war for Moscow, is to control all of Donetsk. And after more than 4 years, the Ukrainians still hold cities inside it. Sloviansk, Kostyantynivka's approaches, Druzhkivka. ISW's July report notes Russian forces pushed around Sloviansk and around the Kostyantynivka, Druzhkivka line, and on those days did not advance. Ukrainian troops counterattacked. So the land Putin wanted the Anchorage deal to deliver on paper is the exact same land his soldiers keep failing to take with rifles. That's not a coincidence. That's the reason the paper mattered so much. And this is where you start to feel the thing underneath the thing. Because there's a genuinely unsettling question buried in all of this, and serious analysts are raising it, not tinfoil people. What does Putin actually know? Authoritarian systems have a structural flaw. The people around the leader are afraid to bring him bad news. So the reports flow upward, and at each level they get a little rosier, a little more confident, until what reaches the top is a war that's going better than the one actually being fought. If you've spent a year being told the front is about to break, and then you're offered a diplomatic path to just formalize the win, of course you take it, of course you build a whole narrative around it. And maybe, just maybe, part of why the spirit of Anchorage felt so real inside the Kremlin is that Putin was working from a picture of the battlefield that was more optimistic than the truth on the ground. I don't want to overstate that. It's an inference, not a confirmed fact. Nobody has a transcript of what his generals whispered to him, but the pattern fits. Deadline after deadline for taking Donbas has come and gone since 2022. Ukrainian officials have long said Moscow keeps missing its own internal timelines, and a leader who keeps setting dates that don't hold is either lying to the public or being lied to himself. Neither is comfortable. Now flip the board, because the other half of this is the part Americans should actually care about, where the leverage is moving. While Russia's advance has slowed to a crawl, Ukraine has been doing something different. It stopped trying to match Russia's gun for gun and started going after the thing that funds the whole war, oil. Over the last several weeks, Ukrainian long-range drones have been hitting refineries deep inside Russia. Not near the front, but 800,000, 1,300 kilometers back. The UFA refinery, one of Russia's biggest producers of lubricants, struck twice in a single week. A plant making missile components in Penza, facilities in the Nizhny Novgorod region east of Moscow. Railway bridges feeding the occupied territories in Luhansk. And this is doing something artillery duels never could. It's producing fuel shortages inside Russia, gasoline lines, economic friction in a country that sells oil to survive. Zelensky has been open about the design of it. He described it as roughly a 40-day campaign aimed at pressuring Russia to end the war. And after the latest refinery strike, he framed it plainly. This is a just response. Peace is needed. And Russia's leadership has every opportunity to end this. The message underneath is colder than the words. It's this: you cannot afford to keep doing this, and we're going to keep proving it. Now, I have to be honest about the cost, because this is not a clean story, and I won't pretend it is. Russia hit back hard. On the night of July 2nd, a major drone and missile barrage on Kiev killed at least 17 civilians and injured more than 90, with around 20 residential buildings damaged. Moscow called it retaliation for the refinery strikes. Ukraine's foreign minister rejected that framing and called it what it looks like: the aggressor striking apartment blocks. Whatever label you put on it, real people died in the dark in a European capital this week. That's the actual texture of this war right now: slower Russian advance. Yes. Rising Ukrainian leverage. Yes. And still civilians pulled from rubble at dawn. So let's connect it back to the money. when the is about where your world and this war intersect. Reason the anchorage question isn't academic is it's really a question about who ended up paying and on what terms. If the spirit of Anchorage had held, if Washington had genuinely committed to pressuring Kiev into surrendering the whole Donbas, it would have set a precedent with a very long shadow. Reward a territorial invasion with recognition of the territory, and you've just published a manual. Zelensky makes this argument constantly, and whether or not you like him, the logic is hard to dodge. Rewarding aggression tends to produce more aggression. Analysts warn the Kremlin is already positioning to say the West betrayed Russia. A narrative you build not to end a war, but to justify escalating one and to prime a population for more mobilization ahead of Russia's own election calendar. And on the American side, the posture has been shifting. Reporting around the G7 suggested Trump had grown frustrated with Putin, that he floated, walking away from the so-called Anchorage understandings altogether, moving away from handing over territory and toward the idea of just freezing the lines where they are. European leaders, for their part, reportedly aren't sure he'll follow through on any of it. That skepticism is its own data point. It tells you the Allies are pricing in an American position that could move in either direction on any given week. Here's the frame I keep coming back to for a year. The world argued about a deal that turned out not to exist. And the moment it became clear the deal was a ghost, you could suddenly see what had been hidden behind it. A Russian army that can't finish the job it started. A Russian economy taking drone strikes to its oil arteries. A Russian leader who may or may not be getting the truth about his own war. And a Ukrainian strategy that stopped trying to win the old way and started making the war too expensive to keep waging. The spirit of Anchorage was never really about Anchorage. It was Moscow trying to get at a table what it couldn't get in the field. And now the table's empty, the field's frozen, and the fuel's running short. So the deal Putin says Trump broke, the one he now admits was never signed. Maybe it was never a deal at all. Maybe it was a story a man tells when the map on the wall stops matching the map in his head. If Russia couldn't take Donbas over 4 years with everything it had, what exactly makes anyone think a signature would have changed the ground? And if the ground can't be changed, what happens to a war built entirely on the promise that it could? I'll see you in the next one.